invite Mr. Raghu Raman, President, Risk and Security, New Ventures, Reliance Industries Limited. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Shelley. Honorable Minister and dignitaries present here, and of course, a whole host of professionals in the career and in the field of security. I had just 4 or 5 observations and thoughts to share, beginning with the fact that I have always been a fascinated student of terrorism and seen how over the years it has evolved. It's very interesting that some of the basic principles have always remained the same, and how based on those basic principles the paradigms have constantly kept shifting, and unfortunately how the security forces, and not just in India, the world over, security forces have always tried to continuously play catch up. And it's interesting that you began by giving the history of terrorism as the Hashashins, and from which the English word assassins comes. But an interesting anecdote is the word Hashashin comes from hashish. These terrorists used to be overdosed with hashish, or in other words, brainwashed, and then sent into the missions, and that is why they could take extraordinary risks, and that is why they would always have an advantage over the security forces, because no matter how dedicated or professional a security force is, they can never match with a side which is looking at a one-way ticket. Because in every planning of the security forces, you have to plan as to how you're going to extricate that force from the operations, whereas the terrorists have the advantage of deciding that there is no extrication required. The 8 men or 10 men who are going into operations are going on a one-way ticket, and that is why, to begin with, it is an uneven battle. Having said that, there are certain paradigm changes that have taken place in the last 10 years, or I would say in the recent decade, which are turning the complete paradigm of how to combat terrorism. And I'm also kind of sad to observe that this paradigm shift is still not being factored in the counter-terrorism strategy. We are still continuing to play catch-up with many of these paradigm shifts, and I'll just name a few of them. Before the 90s, terrorism was a very hierarchical-driven organization. And those of you, many people sitting over here have had the experience of dealing in Kashmir or Punjab, in India itself, where various different terror organizations were also fiercely competing with each other for supremacy. If you look at Sri Lanka, Prabhakaran was spending equal amount of time fighting the other factions who were fighting the Sinhalese government than fighting the Sinhalese government itself. In 90s, different models started emerging, and I don't think we have ever credited Osama bin Laden in his terms of a paradigm shift or a leadership qualities that he displayed in creating the first franchised model of terrorism, where basically the ideology is tight, but the controls are loose, where different groups from all over the world are brought into Afghanistan, in erstwhile the breeding ground, trained there, given the ideological training, the tools, the technology, and then told to go and operate in a franchise model. So you have a Boko Haram which is operating in Africa, you have a different group operating in Indonesia, you have the Indian Mujahideen, and you have all of these local flavors, and all they need to do is to do what they want to do, just have a bracket AQ attached as a suffix to their name. It's almost like opening franchises, but giving local leaders the initiative. So if you look at that paradigm, it is tight ideology and loose controls. And if you just look at how the good guys fight the battle, it's the diametric opposite. It's a loose ideology and extremely tight control in every operation. And that is why when we meet this asymmetric adversary, it's a battle that is set up for failure. The second part is their extremely innovative leveraging of communication tools. And this is not just social media. Terrorism is actually a battle of the mind. It's got nothing to do with the actual number killed. And I'm sure all of us have looked at the video of a throat cutting in horror. And many of us who are soldiers here, who have spent some time in uniform, know that. And I know it sounds extremely cruel to say this, and it sounds very, very politically incorrect to say this, But the fact is that when you cut the throat of a man and he dies in 1 minute, it is as good or as bad as somebody who's shot in 26/11 and takes 8 hours to die painfully with 3 or 4 bullet wounds. So in terms of absolute trauma or absolute pain, matter of fact, a 1 minute throat slitting is a faster way to go. But it's Brisson's effect that it has on social media. When it is put out on social media, translated in 18 different languages, shot in high definition from different angles, and that medium is going out there, it has a force multiplier effect, which unfortunately the bad guys have learned how to master much, much, much better. And we are actually seeing our own handicap in the good guy side when the minister himself says that he is afraid to speak, because the way it will be translated will be completely different. So the communication medium, which is controlled by a handful of people, literally, is far more powerful than a state which has the entire medium at their disposal. They have departments, they have creative firms, they have consulting agencies, and yet they are not able to communicate their point of view. And if we understand that for the terrorists, the ground of tactical importance, this is a very famous military term, and it's a very basic term. The ground of tactical importance is defined as that ground, the loss of which will render the defender incapable of fighting the battle. Until now, that ground used to be physical. Until now, even if you look at the Naxal operations, it's a physical ground that they're trying to occupy. But in the new paradigm of terrorism, this ground of tactical importance is the psyche of the people. If people start giving survey results that we don't believe that the state is looking after us well, we don't believe the state is equipped, 40%, 45% of the people still believe that the state is not doing adequate to safeguard them, then the terrorists are winning. Because regardless of whether people are dying or not, we pay a very heavy price for terrorism on a daily basis. And let me explain that to you with an example. After 26/11, many protocols were introduced, and of course many steps were taken. Hubs were NSG hubs were proliferated. All these hotels, including the one we are right now, has started drills, and all of these drills come at a cost. So when you buy a cup of coffee in this hotel, the additional 5 or 10 rupees surcharge that you have to pay because of that DFMD scanner and the mirror under your car and the 7 million private sector security personnel, this is a cost of terrorism we are paying on a daily basis. When you have to pay a Bombay Delhi ticket to, let's say, Indigo, and you have a surcharge of another 1,000 rupees added to that ticket because of the downtime of that aircraft, because now the amount of security checks that go into making a flight happen lowers the utilization rate of the aircraft, and the aircraft must recover in 15 trips what it would have originally recovered in 18 trips. We are paying that cost of security on a daily basis. Now, this cost of security, nobody is looking at, because we have switched this on 7 years ago. No committee will sit down. Nobody will, take a call and say, can we lower some of these costs? These are all economic costs that we pay on a constant basis. So unless we have a visibility of how much we are paying for terrorism, and we keep confusing terrorism with some bombing incident and some shooting incident, and believing that if there is no shooting incident, we have controlled terrorism, I think that's a fallacy. We have not. Because we are expending valuable resources for a developing country, which should be going into building hospitals, which should be going into building schools, which should be going into training teachers, plumbers, engineers, into security-related infrastructure. So each time we take an able-bodied man whom we train for 2 or 3 years, and for 25 years of his career he stands with a metal weapon on a road, we have essentially taken away an engineer, driver, plumber, teacher from the functioning economy and put him into a consuming economy, and this ratio cannot keep on going on and on and on. We can't keep on raising more battalions and more battalions and more, because that's exactly what the terrorists or any other hostile element would want us to do. They would want us to take valuable resources and put it in places which is non-growth. And this aspect of understanding terrorism, unfortunately, is not being looked at all. We are constantly asking for more CCTV, more equipment, not realizing that this is exactly playing into the hands of a strategic thinker who is using terrorism as a tool to make us go down a separate path. The third Paradigm shift which is happening is small cell operations. So now, if you compare whether it's the attack in France or the one in Mumbai or the one before that in 9/11, you will see there is a steady reduction of centralized control and elaborate planning. 9/11 obviously took several months of planning. It was a very, very elaborate operation. The first attack in Mumbai, 26/11, was again several months of planning. But when you see something like what happened in Paris recently, you find that the reduction of planning time and the increase of local initiative is actually going to the other side, which essentially means that we are going to see a lot more of such attacks which will happen. Now, what does that mean from a security point of view? I think the first and foremost thing it means, and I know this sounds very, very counterintuitive, the first thing I think everybody has to do is expectation management. If we start talking about zero tolerance to terrorism, we have to realize that how can you have zero tolerance to terrorism in a country that is tolerant of every other crime? So if we are tolerant of allowing fake DVDs to come in, fake Louis Vuitton bags which are sold in every street, fake medicines in our markets, if all of that is being allowed, but we say only when it comes to terrorism, somehow our officers will become much more honest. They will allow a container which is full of DVDs, pirated DVDs to pass through, but it will not contain RDX. It doesn't work that way. You can't have zero tolerance to terrorism while being tolerant of every other form of corruption, every other form of crime. It's an unattainable goal. And I think someone has to start realizing that it is an unattainable goal. We cannot do it. You simply cannot say that in this muddied, polluted water, I will make a conclave of clean water. It cannot work. So either that cleansing has to happen across the board, or we have to acknowledge that last year alone, we lost about 2 lakh people in road accidents. We lost about 4 to 5 lakh people on account of diseases that could be prevented. We lose millions of people because of food adulteration. We lose millions of people because of basic hygiene not being there in hospitals. And yeah, we lose about 200-300 people on terrorism. But the mindshare that we accord to this, vis-a-vis everything else, is exactly what the terrorists want us to do. That's exactly what we are sort of walking up the garden path that they are building for us. So in a way, the answer to some of these paradigm shifts is making some paradigm shifts of our own. Mothers in Japan teach their children what to do whenever there's an earthquake. Mothers in Gaza, the Palestinian Strip, and many of the strife-prone areas, even in India, in the border areas, parents teach their children that whenever shelling starts, what do you do? I think it's time now to acknowledge that the civilians are the battlefield. This is not a fight between terrorists and security forces trying to reach every place where there is going to be a terror attack. That's not going to happen. It just is impossible. You can create hubs. The hubs are only places where the terrorists will not hit the next time. They will hit somewhere else where there is no hub. They will hit a place. I mean, it's a very interesting paradigm to see that after 26/11, all hotels were safeguarded, but the Paris attack took place in restaurants outside. So what do we do now? Do we now start doing underbelly scanners on restaurants outside on the road? So at the end of the day, we have to acknowledge that civilians are the target and civilians are the battlefield. And unfortunately, civilians will have to start becoming combatants also. And there are some good examples of this, starting from 9/11. The aircraft that was going to be crashed into Washington, D.C. was stormed by some of the passengers. And yes, 44 people died, including the 4 hijackers. But that aircraft was not crashed into a building, thus saving probably hundreds of lives. 2 attacks that occurred in the French TGV, where citizens just took charge and decided that they were not going to lay down and die, actually resulted in 0 casualty and a capture of some of the terrorists. I think this mindset has to start changing. We need to, our children know, they can ace any competitive exam because they are taught at that level itself, but do they know what to do in a stampede? Do our children know that they have the latest iPhones, but they can't remember a single phone number if the phone is not available with them? They don't. So the basic drills of safety and security, I think we have to now start involving our society in it, because there is no other option. I would want my child to know what to do in case there is a shooting that happens when he or she is in a hotel. What should that person do? We don't even look at those basic drills, but we talk about some 80 feet, 1,000, about how countries need to collaborate and how the world needs to come together. Whereas we need to probably start beginning. I mean, I was given some statistics in Bombay, which I don't know how far it's accurate, but it was ridiculous, even if it was not accurate to the decimal point, of the number of people who actually get the verification of their servants and tenants done. It's actually lower than 2 digits. So while we talk about what the government should do, what the state security forces should do, shouldn't we at least begin by registering or doing the basic checks that we were supposed to be doing almost a decade ago? Now, the point is that if we honestly believe that the civilian population is the target and civilian population is the battlefield, what are we doing to structurally prepare the civilian population of this country? Terrorism is not going to go away. I think anybody sitting over here who believes that this is a passing phase, has to be drinking something which I'd like to also, take a drink of, because I'll sleep better. Terrorism is here to stay. Not only is it here to stay, some of the older movements we are seeing getting revived now. So a problem that was settled in Punjab is showing its head all over again. So it's very much going to be the new format of battle. How are we preparing for this new format of battle, whether it's in terms of developing structures for public-private partnership? We keep talking about public-private partnership. I've been hearing this buzzword for the last decade or so. But what are the structures we have to make it happen? What is the structure that enables the government to leverage national capacity? Instead of constantly talking about it, what is the framework that has been changed, which will allow the government to leverage, just like the US has leveraged the Silicon Valley's talent into the fight against terror? And let me give you some numbers there, which you can actually Google and you'll find it very interesting. The US has committed last year that they will spend $11 billion on climate change. $11 billion on climate change. They have committed $16 billion on cybersecurity and cyberspace, which is $5 billion more than what the president has committed on climate change. $156 billion is the annual revenue of 19 companies in the US who are involved in analytical operations, which includes, by the way, Google, Yahoo, Microsoft, and all of these companies, all of these companies, as you might know, are also interestingly signatories to the PRISM program. And those of you who don't know what a PRISM program is, it is the NSA's surveillance program, which obviously had its legitimacy in counter-terror. At least that's how it began. What else it does is a different story. But the fact is that the US budget is $16 billion of the state and $156 billion of the private sector. That's the ratio. That's the delta. That's the kind of 10 times the participation in the battle against terror comes with money, analytics, talent, engineers, people from the private sector. That is leveraging national capacity. Hiring 20 people in some department as data entry operators is not leveraging national capacity. Now, if we don't rewire our protocols and our procedures, unless we go back to the drawing board and say, in today's scenario, and again, there's no one to be blamed for this, this is the system. It takes us anywhere between 6 to 9 months to get an RFP written. Now, that is the time in which the world's terrorist operations have undergone 3 or 4 cycles in terms of how they operate. The terror groups have access to tools, technology, learning curve, which is 1 light year ahead of any government department. Not just in India, all over the world. All over the world, people struggle to keep pace with what is happening in the terror environment, and we are constantly playing catch up, and we are constantly whining about why this doesn't happen, why that doesn't happen, why nations don't collaborate. But at the grassroots level, no one is saying that we need to rub the slate and restart some of these processes because the paradigms have changed. Let me just sort of recap this with an analogy that we are all familiar with. Warfare started in land centuries ago when tribes were attacking each other. When that operations moved to a different theater, which is water, paradigms had to be changed. Org structures had to be changed. Communication methods had to be changed. When it moved to the air, again there was a complete change of doctrine. You could not use the same doctrine of throwing a spear or shooting bow and arrow or firing a rifle from the air. The doctrines had to change. The command and control structures had to change. When it went to space, everything had to change. Even the recruitment methodology of how the government recruits talent into space had to change. New structures had to be put in place. But when we look at the fifth dimension and the sixth dimension where terror is operating right now, which is in cyberspace and social media, we have no change of doctrine. We are applying the same RFPs that we apply to acquire hardware to acquire talent. How will that work? So unless someone says that this is a new paradigm, new battle, and therefore new doctrines will have to be created, we'll constantly keep wondering as to why the terrorists have the upper hand and which department to blame and which officer to sack and which bureaucrat was sleeping on the watch and whom to fix. That's exactly what we'll keep doing. One last point. I think in battles before this, and also in sort of governance before this, let's say 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it was more like a game of chess. You made one move, your opponent made one move. There were some rules. And yes, a superior player would eventually defeat an inferior player. That was the paradigm of fighting battles. So if I go back to my memory of how Punjab was sort of contained and eventually isolated and reduced, it was by an overwhelming force of security, and Punjab was comparatively much easier than even the Naxal problem. Plain land, the people were largely with the government, fringe elements who could be homed in and brought down. In today's world, it's not like a game of chess anymore. Now it's like a game of snooker. You may intend to hit the ball and pot it in. But what other collateral action will happen? How you will create, I mean, not you, but how somebody creates one fringe group thinking that they will be a buffer between the Soviet communist entrance into Asia, and you create that group and suddenly you realize that group after finishing off the Russians is looking to your throat. You create one faction with a limited objective. How that faction will play out, nobody has any idea. So, in many ways, decision makers need to think through the possible implications of that decision, and I'll just use one simple example, which is not some very grand, strategy between countries. It is something as simple as several years ago, many of you might remember, there was a rape case in Gurgaon, when a young woman who was working in a mall was picked up and she was raped in a moving car and dumped somewhere. This happened way before Nirbhaya. And immediately establishment took out certain rules. The first rule they took out was that all women will have to be escorted back home. Many of you who work in BPOs know that this is a problem now in terms of women employees have to be driven back home. And they can't be kept more than 8 o'clock. So immediately a sort of a diktat is given, and whoever gave the diktat is obviously thinking that he or she did a great job. If a firm or an organization has to drop one set of its employees back home, in essence, this one rule has created an environment where the business decision makers will say, don't hire women. Because if you hire women, the cost structure goes up. Now, what happens when one simple order like this is given, that a girl who gets educated in Jalandhar, let's say for 1 lakh, and who is working in Delhi for 6 lakhs, the cost arbitrage is 6 times. This is essentially the model that we also did for many years, training our engineers in IIT and flogging them in California, right? So we train them for a certain amount, and for 5-6 times that multiple, they are leveraged in some other part of the world. Now the same cost arbitrage is happening between tier 4 cities and tier 1 city. But the moment there is a rape like this and that hits the national headlines, then the father in Jalandhar, in Rewari, in Ahmednagar doesn't want to send his daughter to Delhi or to Bombay. Now when that movement stops, that migration stops, it has a triple whammy. The first whammy is that women who would have been emancipated by moving out from that village and come to the city and earn more or less the same amount of salary as a father, and therefore have an equal say in the house, is gone. This woman would have acted as a launch pad for her siblings. She would have acted as a role model. She would have acted as a sort of a harbor where more girls could have come from the hinterland and found occupation which would take their entire economic strata to the next level. That stops. So in one single attempt to prevent the next girl being raped, that one order effectively rapes millions of girls. Now, unless we understand the economic cost of security, how at a macro level there is an economic cost of security, we will constantly keep doing what we believe to be right things, which are very, very tactical, and yes, knee-jerk, and yes, will solve the immediate problem of today, but create complicated problems at a much, much more strategic level. So I think forums like this should, yes, be thinking about the latest gizmo and latest technology and latest CCTV camera and latest cabling and all of that, but far deeper it should be looking at how we need to alter our doctrines. If we have to collaborate, what are the basic structures that have to be put in place? If we have to do a public-private partnership, how current structures are not going to support it and new structures have to be created. Because unless we do that, the topics that will be discussed in these conferences, you take 2015, 2014, 2013, 2012, they have exactly the same flavor. That we need to do more, we need to collaborate more, we need to have more involvement. It is always a question of we need. It's always a question of ideation. It is never the mechanics of taking that ideation into actual implementation on ground. Nobody is looking at the implementation. They are constantly looking at new ideation and new thought process and new reports and new surveys that we'll keep handing over to whoever takes those surveys and does whatever with it. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much.